Today on the show, I chat with Dr. Stephanie Takaragawa about a course she teaches at Chapman University called The Anthropology of Space and Place. So what does this have to do with Disney? Well, Stephanie takes her students to Disneyland as part of the course curriculum. In addition to discussing her course, we also touch on using the teachings of Walt Disney and the Walt Disney Company in colleges all over the country. It's more common than you might think. On a personal note, I've had a ton of great conversations on this podcast through the years, but this one is definitely toward the top of my list. My brain was firing off with excitement during this conversation, and I can't wait for you to hear it. So, here we go.
It's time to dive into today's Disney dialogue.
Hello, Stephanie, and welcome to Disney Coast to Coast. How you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you so much, Jeff.
I'm excited to get into our conversation, but before we jump into it, I just want to mention how we first met. And that is because Chapman University, where you teach, was doing this really cool, after hours Disney seminars, completely free for the public. And I decided to come to these. The first one was a past guest of this podcast, Disney Imagineer Tom Morris. I went to one with Disney legend Joe Rohde, which was awesome. Did you go to all four of them? Or I only made it to two.
Yes, I did get to go to all four, but I had to leave early from one of them. But Joe Rohde really was amazing.
Yeah, Joe Rohde is fantastic, and it was a great way to wrap things up. But we met there, and you just mentioned, you're like, oh, I teach a Disney course at this university. And I was like, how fascinating. And just the idea of Disney college courses is so fascinating to me. Yours is called The Anthropology of Space and Place. And I just want to start off with, can you please, for the layman out there, define anthropology and explain what the anthropology of space and place means?
Sure. Anthropology is really just the study of culture, but I think a lot of people conflate it with things like archaeology, and they think about cultures that are far and wide away from here, or ancient people, or, it really just ends up being a lot of people that live in the jungle or people that live in tribes and other kinds of culture. But really, what I study is contemporary culture, and I study popular culture. And so one of the things I'm interested in is how different kinds of spaces really compel people to behave, right? So when you think about, there's a whole field of anthropology of space and place and cultural anthropology. But, all of our behavior is constrained by culture. And we don't really think about it because I'm a teacher, when I go into the classroom, I go to the front of the room and the students all sit at desks and stare at me, even though they could sit on the floor or sit on the table or sit in the teacher's chair. But we've all learned and we've all been socialized into how it is that we behave in any particular space, right? Go into an elevator and face people or start singing, and you will see that there are rules in all the spaces. And I was particularly interested in what they call non-places, where do people learn how to behave in an airport or Disneyland? And so, the reality is that in the architecture or in the color design or in, any part of the ways that people put spaces together to make places, they are compelling you to behave in particular cultured ways. And so with Disneyland, a lot of, what makes it so unique is this idea that it is the happiest place in the world. But really, what makes that happy, right? So how is it that color or design or sound really help people be happy? And as a professor, I thought, in the grand scheme of things, Disneyland on its own doesn't seem that exceptional, right? You're 80,000 people fit in there or something, and the majority of them are screaming, sticky, smelly children, and everybody is running around with a smile on their face and super happy to pay $5 for a churro or $12 for a cheeseburger. And I thought, if I can make my classroom like that, then people would be fighting to get into my class, and they would, want to learn, and they would want to be there because, sometimes I feel like maybe they don't entirely want to be in my classroom. So I actually asked the class, how do we create a space that is as inviting as Disneyland? And this was when I was teaching at the University of Redlands 20 years ago. And the students said, well, why don't we go to Disneyland and find out what they do? And of course, we all thought that was not possible. But we ended up actually creating a short class and going to Disneyland to figure that out, because at the end of the day, anthropology is about culture. So what does the culture of Disneyland look like? And clearly they've put a lot of time and effort in creating a space and creating a culture for themselves that is part of this happiest place on earth. And our job was to figure out how maybe we could leverage some of that to make my classroom like at least a happier place on the earth.
Okay, interesting. So it wasn't just about examining what they were doing in the park. It was actually like bringing it into the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's what I said. I mean, I really just wanted to go to Disneyland again, but I think, I was raised at Disneyland. So for me, it seemed like a natural place to study and I actually did, like when I was in grad school, I did do a study at Disney World in Florida. Like I briefly went down for a week, which is like not at all real anthropology, which takes years and years. But I spent a week at Disney World and Epcot to try to understand what that culture looked like. And so, the students knew I had done that. So they thought, I think they just wanted to go to Disneyland. Maybe I did too. But they are all connected.
Back to the title of the course, The Anthropology of Space and Place. Like, what other sorts of anthropology is there? Isn't it always space and place?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're always thinking about culture in particular ways. And I think we don't spend enough time looking at the design, though. I mean, we know those things inherently about classrooms or about elevators or airports. But we don't really think about how they are compelling us to behave, right? There's like a lot of social theorists like Michel Foucault, who has this theory of the panopticon and surveillance that like, if people are looking at you or you think people are looking at you, you're going to behave in different ways. So we thought, like, can we mobilize that kind of a theory by understanding why people seem to be so well behaved at Disneyland, right? So like, why are they happy? There seems to be no stress. Like, that is so expensive. Like, that would stress me out knowing how much money I was spending all the time, or like surrounded by children or strangers, whatever it is. It really was trying to look at social theory to explain why people are happy or compelled to behave better as humans, because humans don't behave well in general. So I think a lot of anthropology looks at space or places as specific things that are not embedded, right? Like we look at religious institutions as a place, as part of a culture, but not as the whole thing. So we really inverted this by starting with analyzing the space and the behavior towards the space and all of the objects, right? How do people interact with objects within any space? And we started there, and that's really what the class is about. It looks less at sort of collective human to human behavior, but more how human behavior is modified specifically by its environment. And that, I think, is what the anthropology of space and place, or the anthropology of the built environment, really focuses on. It is a regular part of cultural anthropology, but in this instance, we're just really focusing on those theories more than anything else.
Okay, so this is fascinating. So how long ago did you start teaching this course?
The first time I taught it at the University of Redlands was 2007, I think.
Okay.
And then when I started teaching at Chapman, I actually didn't bring it up. I didn't say I teach class on Disneyland, even though I was like, wow, I'm really close to Disneyland now. Before it took an hour to get there. Now it would take literally 5 minutes. But I was worried that as a new faculty member, they wouldn't take me seriously, because teaching things like pop culture already is not always, at least not then, 20 years ago, as well regarded. Now people are realizing, oh, we have to have classes on Taylor Swift or K-pop Demon Hunters in order to engage the students. But then it was, and I was new, so I didn't actually pitch the class. I just taught regular anthropology classes on social problems, or I think I taught a class on prisons and, tuberculosis, cultural anthropology, introductory classes. But then the chair came to me and said, okay, so we know you teach this class at Redlands called The Anthropology of Disneyland. Why are you not offering that here? And so I was surprised that actually I found out that was one of the reasons I think they hired me, was because they thought that the classes that I taught were super interesting. So I taught that for the first time at Chapman in 2009. And I have taught it ever since. We teach it in the inner term, which is a January term, so it's only 4 weeks long. But because it's only 4 weeks long, we meet for 12 hours a week. which is pretty intensive.
Wow.
And yeah, so we have 3 4-hour days. It's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. On Tuesdays, we read a lot of social theory and we discuss a lot of ways in which we think this is related to behavior at Disneyland. On Wednesdays, we go to Disneyland and they have to do field work by looking at the theories and looking at behavior. And then on Thursdays, we come back and we talk about how they work. So they're applying theory to behavior every day. And they have to read about 300 to 600 pages of text a week. And then their homework is to go to Disneyland on the weekends and like observe other things. And so it's like this constant, and because it's only one class, right? They're only taking one class in the month of January, as opposed to a regular semester where their attention is divided between 5 classes or 6 classes or whatever they're taking. They're thinking about this class 24/7, which means like on the weekends, I'm getting emails from students like, I just read this or I just saw this and I'm thinking about this. So it's really immersive because all of their attention is focused on the anthropology of space and place and Disneyland. Plus, they get to say, my homework is to go to Disneyland, and all of their friends who are in other classes get jealous and they get to put this all on social media. Because part of it is to also generate responses from people in the world to see what people think about Disneyland, right? Anthropology is about understanding how people make sense of the world, right? How culture works. And so sometimes they need feedback from other people, both people who love and don't understand Disneyland, because it gives us different questions. And I have been teaching this class at Chapman pretty much every year except for the pandemic years since 2009. And every class is different. We learn different things. And, you know, it's because the culture of Disney is always changing. The culture of, the pass holders versus non-pass holders, like people who I've met pass holders who live in other states, right? And they like come here regularly, or people who have never been to Disneyland, because there's always like one student every semester who's never been to Disneyland and they have some thoughts about that. And the other students really want to make sure that that student enjoys Disneyland as much as they do, because the majority of the class are super fans. Of course, that's not surprising because it's also incredibly expensive to go to Disneyland. So those kids want to make sure that this person who may have once been a hater of Disneyland is then converted to see Disneyland through their eyes, which I always think is really interesting because everyone has a different idea of what their perfect day at the park looks like. And so it's also nice to see like the human side of students where they're like both learning and also enjoying and reliving their childhood, but also trying to share those ideas with other students.
I have a question that might be really difficult to answer, and I'm sure you keep up on Disneyland stuff that's going on, but you mentioned it's interesting. Why is everybody here so happy, right? Let's study that. In recent years, I'd say in the last 2 or 3 years, if you're in the Disney fandom, I feel like we've seen more and more anger issues, to put it in a nicer phrase, I guess, but like fights breaking out in the parks. So is that something that has changed at Disneyland? Like, is it something that Disneyland has done that has changed? Or is it we just as a society are angry?
It's funny because every time there's a fight at Disneyland, like somebody sends me, or like a whole bunch of people send me all of the news coverage, and they're like, well, what do you think about this? And it is true. I don't know. There's a lot of people who have said that, in the last 15 years, Disney has changed as a culture. I don't know that I believe that. Like, a lot of people believe that Disneyland has recently cared more about money than it does about its guests, right? And that it's become much more sort of, capital driven. And that's one of the reasons that it's become like this, because a lot of the magic is gone. I don't know, honestly, like what that is about, why that happens, because it is so ridiculously expensive. I can understand that it is quite stressful. And, Disneyland is not a place for everybody. It seems like it's, obviously super classist in the amount of money that it costs for people to go to. But I feel like there's so much at stake for people to have a good time when they feel like that their, happiest day on earth is getting interrupted by somebody else, that's one of the reasons that there seems to be more fights and more problems. And maybe it is because like a lot of society is just more contentious, which I hate to say, like but we are really divided as a country. But this has predated this sort of more recent division. I may agree that people in general find Disneyland to be less magical than they once did, at least like in my era. I don't know if the annual passes are part of that because, now people feel entitled to be able to go all the time. It gives them a sense of ownership. I know that a lot of people with annual passes believe that they know better than everybody else and that they have more entitlement. Like I've heard people, ask like, where's the section for the annual pass holders? And they're like, there's no section for annual pass holders. You just go watch the parade. And so, this idea that there's this familiarity and regularity with the park, whereas before, annual passes, or when annual passes were something that not so many people had, and before they tiered them all out and made like a hierarchy of pass holders, I feel like there was some differences. And, maybe it is just sort of the expansion of, Disney incorporating as many things as possible. I mean, I'm old school. I thought Toontown was like a weird new thing. I still think it's a weird new part of Disneyland, even though it's like 30 years old. And California Adventure, I'm like, I don't know what that is. I go there, but I was really resistant to that, like to my nostalgic idea of, what Disneyland is, that I went to for the first time like in 1970 when apparently I was 6 months old, and like have gone, apparently according to my parents, every month until I was 5. So like I guess that's less magical, but for me it was magical every single time. But now that I go so often, maybe I do see it in more jaded ways. That was too long of an answer.
No. I love this answer, and it has my head going in a different direction than I was planning, but I kind of love this. And forgive me if this is going a little off topic of your expertise, but do you think for the majority of people, there just comes a time, and I don't know if this is Disney fandom thing or just like life in general, but is there a time where it's just like, oh, this place is no longer meant for me specifically, like it's time for me to pass the baton to the next generation, and it's now their Disneyland. I'm still welcome, but the focus is not me.
Yeah, that may be the case. I mean, I've heard a lot of people talk about different aspects of Disneyland. When I first started teaching about Disney, it wasn't about the park, right? It was a mass media course, right? Talked about all the things that people in sociology talk about when it comes to Disney character representations, right? The like weird implicit racism and sexism and heteronormativity and like all of these representational problems in those stereotypes. And when I started teaching the Anthropology of Space and Place class, like I have a particular relationship to Disneyland. I am a, Japanese American woman from Los Angeles, which means like the odds are I'm like was raised at Disneyland. And one of my students, who was a Black student, said, I've taken every class with you, but I cannot take the Disneyland class because Disneyland doesn't like Black folks. And I thought that was a really interesting thing that I had never had to think about. And now that I think about it, it made sense. And he had said, when you walk in, what you see is like, pre-segregation era America. And that's how they represent safety. And, for a long time, Disneyland's, relationship, with its representations of any BIPOC character was nothing or was, like a comic relief, right? So like, you've heard all of the, even like the Jim Crows, right? And Dumbo, but like later than that, in Tarzan, it's been pointed out that they have an entire, they use Africa as a backdrop without actually having any Africans in it. Or, the hyenas in the Lion King are also sort of stereotypically problematic, even though I'm like, those are famous comedians who happen to be racialized. But it made me think about Disney parks in a way that I had never thought about it before, as something that was not accessible to all people and potentially, in its sort of implicit narrative, racist. And so, that was something that I then wonder, like, how does that affect the demographic who is coming there and what their ideas are about the park? And I've lost the question because I think I went off on a tangent.
No, you're good. That's fascinating. Like, I'm literally, my mind's blowing up as you're talking. This is great. My question was, does it get to a point, just perhaps a certain age in life, where you're like, this no longer belongs to me?
Yeah. And so I think that student actually made me think about Disneyland in a different way that did change my relationship to it and did make me more critical because I had been so tied up in like the fantasy of like the nostalgia of being a little kid when I didn't have to worry about anything. And like my biggest like issue was like, which ride am I going to go on next? Or like, am I going to get like a, one of those toffee things or like a peanuttle, right? Like the things that you have to worry about in Disneyland have always been so superficial. And, early Disneyland, before there were things like fast passes, like there were no clocks. People didn't know what time it was. Like the only time you knew which time it was like when the small world things went off. But that was it. Like you can't see the outside world. You have no sense of time. And so like it really created this like free play space. And I think for me, as those things changed, as you started to have to think about time because fast passes or you can only get into restaurants at particular times because everything is now reservation. I think all of that has changed my relationship to it and maybe changed a lot of people's relationship to it because they wanted the nostalgia of the olden days, right? When you just walked into a restaurant because the parks were not crazy overcrowded. But also looking at it more critically and looking at those representational spaces, I was like, Disneyland would look very different with separate but equal, water fountains. But like that's the period that it is representing in some ways. So, that was one of the things that I had to think about. But it is possible, right? All of the changes over time, those small incursions have probably taken away magic for a lot of people or changed people's relationships. Like, my friends go to Disneyland because they love Star Wars Land. I'm like, I'm just going to like pretend like I don't see that whole part of the park because that is not right. But, it is how that works. And when I'm in Star Wars Land, I'm fine with it. But it's not part of Disneyland to me, right?
Well, what's so fascinating about that? And, I had that concern when Star Wars Galaxy's Edge was announced for Disneyland Park and not Disney California Adventure. I think a lot of, traditional Disneyland fans were like, huh, what? It's going to like change something in the park. Here's the fascinating thing for me anyway. I forget it's there until I'm in the land. It's so out of the way. It's so on the perimeter that there are times I go to the park and just don't walk through it. And then, of course, there are times that I do go to it, but it never feels that it's in the way. And a lot of that is much of it was prior backstage space. Rest in peace, Big Thunder Ranch. But, a lot of it was backstage space. So, but it is fascinating because talk about a space that felt like it could have changed the whole park. And I'm happy to say it didn't affect it, for me anyway, as much as I thought it would.
No, you're right. It is easy to avoid, but when you're in it, it is like a totally different immersive experience.
Yeah. I know we could never do this these days, but I would love for you to teach your course like on a day or do what you do in the park with your students on a day where like clocks weren't around and the app didn't exist and the lightning lanes didn't exist and reservations. Like I would just love to see from a cultural societal point of view, like, is it a better time? Like, I'm being old man nostalgic right now, but like I would love to go back and erase so much of what's just the norm now and frankly can never go backward, sadly.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it would be interesting to see because there was more freedom there. It made it a different kind of space because it wasn't beholden to time. There were, all the things that you feel like, you deal with here. Even, lines were long, but they weren't as long as they are now. And like, you feel like there's like, this 2-tiered system when you can just pay to get a fast pass and not stand in the line and everybody is not the same. So I feel like that's another part of it that changes. But yeah, I think, the old Disneyland where, all of those things were just, everybody seemed, it was more egalitarian maybe. And maybe that's one of the things that's also changed for people. But it is different now when you're constantly on your app. Like, do I have to order food now to walk over here? Or do I make a reservation for this particular thing? So it seems more like work because it adds those things.
Yeah, you've mentioned a couple times kind of just the extreme cost of going to Disneyland or going on a Disney vacation. And it's very costly. I don't think it's ever been one of those things that was ever like inexpensive for people, but it was definitely much more manageable. But one of the things that drives me nuts, and once again, I apologize if this is going off of away from your expertise here, but one of the things that has driven me crazy in the last 10 years, where the price has become frankly obnoxious, is this continued narrative in marketing that visiting Walt Disney World or visiting Disneyland is like a birthright in America. That's the message that they portray. And it's kind of a message that I feel like, accept as citizens of America. Yet the reality is many, many people will never get there. And then there are a stupid amount of people like us who go there way more often than a human probably should, frankly. And this narrative of this is your birthright, like, I find fascinating when it so clearly is not.
Yeah, I mean, they did a really good job, right, of marketing and getting everybody to say, what are you going to do now? I'm going to Disneyland, right? Like in the 80s, like everybody who you win a championship game. What are you going to do now? You just won this award. I'm going to go to Disneyland. Like they did really an amazing job at sort of prepping the American public to understand Disneyland as something that is a reward for a job well done as an American. And, I think it's because it's so ubiquitous, because of the Disney Channel, because of so many things. But even before the Disney Channel, like you couldn't go into a classroom in the United States where like all the students hadn't been inundated by Disney characters. Isn't like Mickey Mouse the most recognized character in the world?
I believe it's Super Mario, actually. But
that's amazing.
But I think Mickey is second. I believe, I could be mistaken, but I believe it's Super Mario.
Well, I would have also accepted Pokemon, but like it is interesting that like that's changed because when I was growing up, it was always Mickey Mouse, like that, and for some reason Ronald McDonald. But those were the most recognized characters globally, and it's funny because like I will ask my students, and this is like over the last 25 years of teaching, like how many of you have never seen a Disney film? And like inevitably somebody will raise their hand and be like, I've never seen a Disney film, and then the students will all start just like rattling off all the Disney, and then the person will be like, oh, never mind. So, even when they think they haven't, it's just so pervasive that, it is been equated with being a child, is participating in Disney things. And, one of the reasons that I actually was really interested in teaching this course was before I taught at Redlands and at Chapman, my first job my first job out of grad school was at Rutgers. And prior to that, I was a grad student at Temple University in Philadelphia, and I would periodically teach classes as a grad student. And then my first position at Rutgers, I taught these classes on media that we talked about where, we would just look at like, why does it seem realistic that, in Snow White, you have like what is essentially a 14-year-old girl running through the forest, running away from a guy who's trying to chop her heart out with an axe. She runs into a house, and the first thing she starts to do is to clean it because that's what women do, like as a critique. And, the students were like, yes, this is the problem with Disney representations, or, Sleeping Beauty, who's the main character, who I think has 16 lines in, her film, or, as an Asian American, those weird Siamese cats in Lady and the Tramp, which to me are like super racist and problematic. And like, we would talk about those representations and how they impacted people. And the students would just go off for hours and hours picking out all of the ways in which Disney has created these stereotypes. And this was across the board consistent for all the classes that I taught on the East Coast. And then I came to Redlands and I taught the same class. And all of a sudden the students were like arguing with me about, well, that representation can't be viewed that way. If you look at this is a counter narrative, blah, blah, blah. And I'd never had so many students fight with me about Disney and, Disney representations. And I was like, I've been teaching this class like this for years, and I've never had so many students fight with me. And I said, why are you different than the kids on the East Coast? And they're like, because we grew up with Disneyland and we're going to defend it. And like, this is part of who we are. And they're just jealous that they don't have a Disneyland where they live. And like, there is a difference between people who were raised with Disneyland and people who weren't. It's super weird.
You're blowing my mind. This is like so fascinating. I love this so much. Everything you say is sparking so many more questions in my mind. Let me go back. So one of the things that I find fascinating, and I didn't realize this, I'm just like a Disney fan with a lot of opinions. But when my friends started having babies, or my brother had babies, it really showed me how early on we're inundated with Disney, because I would start walking down baby aisles for, sippy cups or looking at diapers. And I was like, oh my God, Mickey Mouse is on everything from like the moment a child is born. It's on everything, which is fascinating. So they're getting you like at a super early age before you're making decisions for yourself. And the other thing that I find so super fascinating is how Disney as a brand, I would say, as annoyed as I am with how much they've diversified with Fox and Lucasfilm and all this stuff that really is off-brand Disney. If you think of like Universal Studios or Warner Brothers, you have these studios that make many different genres of film, and nobody can really pinpoint. Sure, you can say, oh, okay, you think Universal monsters, you think Warner Brothers, you think gangster films, but those are like old school thoughts that I don't think people really think anymore. Yet, Disney is still thought as family-friendly kids' movies in a lot of cases, even though the brand has diversified so much. So like, their strength in branding and marketing seems to like go above and beyond in so many instances, and it kind of blows my mind.
Yeah, there's nothing like that. Like, it is everywhere in the world and all the things, and maybe that's why people feel like it is so embedded in their whole life that it is a birthright, right? Like, they have to participate somehow, some way, because, I guess it was intended, right, to sort of just be like a movie set where you can meet Disney or meet Mickey Mouse and like all of those things. And I feel bad for kids because it is expensive for parents, and like not everyone gets to go, but it is one of those things that people do always like make a plan to take their family to these places. And I think because it's so embedded, even though you're right, it has so much brand diversification, that there is still always Mickey Mouse. There's still always the classic Disney films. Like, most people haven't seen, most of my students like only see films in their lifetime that are like current, but the Disney films, they've seen all of them. Like, that's something that has withstood like a lot of the test of time, even though they don't see other kinds of animated entertainment. I think probably like The Wizard of Oz and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the original one, and then all the Disney films are the only things that are really consistent. But it's like all the Disney films. They've all seen Bambi. They've all seen, Cinderella and Snow White and The Jungle Book. Not Song of the South, but all the other ones.
That is a whole conversation in and of itself. I feel like could be its own whole podcast, but I find that fascinating as well. And it kind of drives me nuts how younger generations seem to have zero interest in things that came before them. So your point that in the exception is Disney, once again, like there just seems to be so many exceptions. And yeah, this is fascinating. Let's get back to your course a little bit, because I know I went way off topic there. But I am just kind of curious, do you need any kind of permission from Disneyland to do this kind of research in the park? And or have you ever been, I don't think Disneyland likes seeing people around with clipboards taking notes. So like, has security ever approached you or a student?
Only once. No, I take it back twice. And so what I do every year, I've done this in different ways. Like, I call them and leave a message. I email them and say, here's my syllabus. Are there any issues? They've never responded to me. I did that. I was concerned. I was like, but anybody can go to Disneyland and do whatever they want. And so long as my students are not being disruptive, then I feel like there's no real problem. There's a really interesting short essay by an anthropologist named Mark Auger that's called An Anthropologist at Disneyland. And he is talking about how he's going to go to Disneyland and do this research project. And he's, got his notebooks and he's got his cameras and he's just going to observe. And is Disneyland going to stop him like when he's going in, because he has all this recording equipment? And, he's like, he's got a video camera. And then he's like, everybody has a video camera. Everybody has, all of these, things to record. I'm just like everybody else. Like, why would I think that? Like, it was his intent. So the first assignment that I have my students do is I make them go to Disneyland and observe. They have to pick one place to sit for an hour and just write down people's behavior. And they're not allowed to be in a place where they can see or hear another student. So basically, what I'm trying to do is to isolate them and to get them to look at Disneyland as an anthropologist who's taking field notes. That's actually not the assignment. The assignment is to make them sit by themselves and do work in Disneyland and make them feel awkward so that they realize that there is a culture of Disneyland and they're not conforming to it. Like, that first assignment is really for them to feel uncomfortable in what it's like to be an outsider in a society. And once they understand that, then they can understand what the culture actually starts to look like. So they always, and then they have to text me, right? Like, I go and I meet with them one-on-one. So I literally like run across Disneyland to find all my students. And I talk to them while they're doing the thing. And they always say things like, well, I was trying to write notes, but I feel like security keeps coming and looking at me, or people come up to me and ask me what I'm doing. But, that's all part of the assignment, is for them to feel the discomfort of not doing the right thing in Disneyland and how it makes people around them behave. So that is a thing. And no one's ever said, why are you here? Like, no Disney employee has ever stopped them. The two people that the Disney employees stopped, and this was also learning for me, was the very first time I ever taught this class. I didn't think about anything. I said, go ahead and study whatever you want. And a student said, I want to study why kids wear costumes and like why, this is like an anime kid and he wanted to study cosplay. I later realized that it's probably not a great idea to have a, 18 to 22-year-old male by themselves who, in his own, dress code, wore a lot of trench coats and black combat boots, taking pictures of little girls dressed up like princesses. So he actually got flagged. They were like, why are you taking pictures of children that are not your children? And why are you by yourself? And he like pulled out the syllabus and like said, I'm taking a class. And I emailed and said, yes, this is a student in my class. Sorry, we will make sure that like this is now an off limits project. Like, if you are a male student, you actually cannot take pictures. If for some reason, if you're a female student, they don't care. But this was one of the things. And then another student got flagged by security because he was by himself and he was just taking pictures of the surveillance. And he was South Asian and looked Middle Eastern. And he got flagged. And he said, they think I'm a terrorist. Can you please come? And those are the only two that have ever been. And, he could have been correct in why he was getting profiled that way. But, I can see Disneyland is paying attention. And, I think those are fair things. Actually, I think they're problematic, but I'm not surprised that it happened. I should have thought about that. I never did because I didn't think about the scope of surveillance. But yeah, a single young man taking pictures of little girls, super creepy, and somebody taking pictures of their surveillance system, I can also see. So those are the only times that has happened.
Disneyland doesn't assist you in any way, right? Like, these kids are buying their way into the park.
They're buying their way into the park. They, you have to have an annual pass or work at Disneyland for the class. I do want to give Disney a heads up every time I teach the class in case there is a problem. But I've talked to a lot of people who work there. A lot of my students work there. I always have at least one Disney employee who is taking the class. And they've said, oh yeah, people know that there are actually more than one class that now comes to Disneyland. We have other classes at Chapman where they will go to Disneyland for a day or something to do a thing. But mine is the only sort of consistent class at Chapman that I'm aware of that goes, once a week during the interterm, and their homework is to go to Disneyland. And the whole point of the class is focused on the park itself.
We were talking a little earlier. I mean, you mentioned how the school Chapman came to you and said, hey, why aren't you teaching this Disneyland class? And, you mentioned how you didn't initially bring it up because you were new faculty and you thought it might ruffle feathers or just get looked at weird. And it's interesting because when I went to one of those seminars, it was mentioned by another faculty member, if colleges are studying Shakespeare, why not Walt Disney? And it's funny, even me as a big Disney fan and who looks at him as a historic figure, even I'm like, it is a little silly, it feels like, to be studying Disney or Disneyland or Walt Disney in a college course. Yet, if Shakespeare, why not Walt Disney? Why do we have this thought process?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this idea that, the ivory tower should be for things that are, much more, I don't know, intellectual. But like Shakespeare wasn't actually, he was a popular playwright in his time, right? That was the popular culture of the time. It's just later that over time things accrue some kind of historic value or, social capital. And so I feel like if this is what our culture is interested in, and it's a huge part of our culture, why are we not studying it? So I did get a lot of pushback actually early on when I started teaching the class, not from my department who wanted me to teach the class, but like other faculty, I could hear them. Or they would say, that's like, you really teach a class on Disneyland? Like you go to Disneyland? And I'm like, yeah, we go to Disneyland and we try to understand why it is that so many people want to go to Disneyland. So many more people want to go to Disneyland than, go to your class. So, what is it about that particular place that makes it so compelling? Like, what is it culturally, socially, psychologically that creates an environment that, people find so compelling that they want to participate in it and they continue to do so repeatedly? I mean, I feel like that's an important part of culture. Why, Mickey Mouse is popular. Like, if we don't understand the general population, like what are the things that people like more, rather than like, why the Mona Lisa is an important painting, which, as somebody who was actually an art historian, I don't like that painting, but, people still feel compelled to appreciate it in particular ways, but because they have to, like people go to museums. And I guess that's where a lot of this research started for me, where, people go to museums because they feel like that's a place that they go to feel cultured and that it's part of education. But I was really intrigued that Epcot Center has all these museums and they actually have exhibitions that, in some cases are objects that have never traveled outside of their home country except for when they go to Epcot, because quite frankly, Disney is one of the only institutions in the world that can properly afford to care for, transport, and insure a lot of precious objects. So my first research project when I was a grad school was actually looking at museums in Epcot Center. And who goes to those? And you know what? No one goes to those. They go into those museums so that there's they get out of the sun and they can go into a quiet space. But I spent a lot of time looking at some of those collections, particularly while I was there. There was a Japanese Netsuke collection that had never left Japan. And it was interesting to see, the scope of objects and the care that they had. These were, really beautiful pieces in a, very well constructed museum site. But the idea of merging sort of popular culture and high culture is still something that people have a lot of problems with. And that's why studying Shakespeare seems like a natural, but studying Disney seems silly. But he has had at least as big of an impact, probably, as Shakespeare has on the United States. Our ideas of creativity, film, animation, creating characters, nostalgia, theme parks, right? I mean, the impact that he's had is significant, but we don't think about it like that because Disneyland is a silly park for kids.
Now, I will say, for anybody listening who's like, oh, a college course on Disney, that sounds easy. I will tell you, as someone who read through your syllabus, I was stressed out reading the course. So I'll read some little excerpts from it. Of course, you say you study culturally learned behavior. Focusing on the environment of Disneyland, we will observe how architecture and the environment and other mitigating social factors encourage certain types of behaviors and create specific types of expectations. Now, in Disneyland, in the world of Disney and theme parks in general, this is very much done by design. This is the job of the folks who create these places. Is it commonly designed in day-to-day life? Do you find that this is thought about? Like, you mentioned airports, or when you walk into a Target, is kind of everywhere we go that's man-made putting this much thought into it? Or is Disney next level?
Well, Disney is next level, right? But a lot of things like shopping malls are now, or for the last 20 or 30 years, have actually taken places like Disneyland into consideration. So Disneyland has become a model in a lot of places for built environments. So that's one of the reasons that it seemed like an easy place to start. When I actually designed the class, though, when I was doing a space and place research, even though Disney was, something that I was always interested in, because I didn't think it was realistic, I designed the first space and place class for Las Vegas, right? So, like, how does Las Vegas as a built environment, a themed environment, which is very similar to Disneyland, like, how does that, impact the way people behave? And it was like during the time period where Vegas's all of its advertising was like, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And so, from an advertising and marketing perspective, as researchers, my students and I were like, well, that's just there to like, inspire bad behavior. But to really think about like, why would they market it that way and what, are the sort of underlying ideological issues with creating that kind of a campaign? That's where the idea of studying space and place in particular kinds of built environments came from, was from understanding Las Vegas theoretically. But I knew that I'd never actually be able to take people to Las Vegas. So it was sort of like a class that I designed, back when I was a grad student, to try to make anthropology more interesting for students. And then we just literally mapped that class right onto Disneyland. When the students were saying, why don't we go to Disneyland? I'm like, oh, I have this shell of a class on space and place that they were like, oh, let's go to Las Vegas. I'm like, yeah, I'm not taking you to Las Vegas.
What are some of the things that the students have learned from their research in the parks that maybe surprised you or just stuck out to you?
I mean, so one of the things was like how people really do modify their behavior. Like, although this has changed. So like 20 years ago when I first started teaching the class, there was much less swearing in the park. Again, fewer fights. But you very rarely heard people swear. And when you did, people would look at them and they would like do that. Now there's more swearing. But, on more than one occasion, like we watched people like start arguing, like couples or families, and then they would actually stop. They would look around. In one case, a family actually left the park, went outside of the park, and started fighting again.
How long ago was that?
That was really early on. That was like one of the first years I taught it. And so that was one of the things that made me think about how behavior really is sort of learned in that environment, because they were fighting and the class actually followed them out to watch them continue their fight outside of the park. Just a couple of them. I was like, stop. They're like, I want to see what's happening. Because, and one of the early, I think it was probably the first time I taught the class at Chapman, I had told them that story because that had happened when I taught it at Redlands. And the Redlands students were the ones who saw it. So the Chapman students decided what they wanted to do was to fake an argument in the park. To see how people would react. And I was like, just be careful because, don't be disruptive. Like you can have a verbal argument. Don't start yelling. Don't start hitting. Don't start swearing. But like you want to see like if you start to have a verbal altercation, what happens? And so the students planned it out. I was like, I don't even want to be a part of this. And when they decided to stage their fight, the first student like turned around and like was like, what did you just say to me? And the other student, like the people stopped and looked, and the other student looked and ran away because all of a sudden they felt the stress of like all the people staring at them. They ran away. So I mean, even though this was their intention, to disrupt the happiest place on earth, or to see, how is it that social control works to keep people on their best behavior, like it just worked immediately on them. So that I thought was kind of interesting. I didn't know a lot about Disneyland because even though I went regular, I wasn't paying attention. So like the porch potatoes, right? Like I learned about the porch potatoes from my students. Like now, I see them. But at the time early on, like I hadn't realized that that was actually a culture of people who, sit around and hang out on the porch. And so that was something that was interesting to learn about. The Disney gangs, I don't see them as much anymore.
No, I think Disney really kind of handled that because that was a thing for a while. At the very least, they're not able to wear their denim jackets anymore.
Yeah.
But, this is just considering how much you've studied Disneyland. we see crazy fans. We see people who, need to be first in line for me, I have a very specific moment where I was like, oh, Disney fans are next level. Like they're different than anywhere else. And it was the day that Luigi's Rollickin' Roadsters replaced the flying tires in Disney California Adventure. And what I mean is, if you look at Luigi's Rollickin' Roadsters, it's a C ticket, right? To use the Disney term. It's not an E by any means.
Yeah.
Yet the line that day, the day it opened, was enormous, hours long. And I was like, any other theme park in the world could open this attraction and it would be maybe a 15-minute wait on an opening day. Yet Disney fans have this insane amount of FOMO, this insane amount of I need to be the first to do it. And I know this probably isn't your specific studies, but like, do you have any opinions on that? Like, does it feel unhealthy or I don't know, any thoughts?
No, I mean, I feel like there is definitely something that Disney has made special and they want to be the first person. And social media is not helping in this situation. A lot of that is like being the first person to be able to like put that out there on, on Instagram or whatever, to be like one of the first people and show that they're all in. But, fandom culture is something that is really just, it is what it is. And like, this is their community and this is how they show, their love and their commitment to things, right? It's like the standing in line for the pins on Thursday, or what is it, Tuesday mornings, or standing in line for the candy cane. Come on, like, all of these things. And that's a good candy cane, but still, it's like a $25 candy cane, but it is good.
I've never waited in the line, so I don't know, because I think it's all virtual queue now at this point for the candy canes because they're so limited.
Okay. But the candy cane's good because I did stand in line for the candy cane, right? Like, you just do these things because it's part of how you show that you're part of a community, right? You're like, voting with your feet, and it is how you're pledging your commitment to these places. So I feel like, but I do feel like social media is a lot of place where that gets reinforced, right? Because there are all of these different, Instagram groups or Facebook groups that, if those still exist, that like, people are demonstrating how it is that they're committed to Disneyland in different ways. So yeah, Disney fandom is next level. Like, that is no joke. I mean, I will be honest, I have an aunt who everything in her house is Disneyland, like, or Disney, paper towel holders and all of the utensils. They're all like Mickey Mouse hands. This is a grown woman. This is my aunt. Half of it comes from like, Disney Tokyo, Disney, Euro Disney, like all of the different things. Every part of her house is like this. This is just like, to me, normal because I was raised, with a lot of this stuff. And I feel like, there is a lot of, I guess, identity tied up into Disney for a lot of people. And I mean, obviously for me too, because I've had a Disneyland pass most of my life, and I have always seen this as something that is, part of, my childhood and my family. So that is what happens.
Yeah, it seems to be beyond fandom. It's a lifestyle for many people at this point.
It's a lifestyle. Yeah.
So you mentioned social media. That's one thing that I'm sure has changed tremendously since you started teaching this course. Another thing that I think has changed quite a bit, and I'm curious if you've probably observed this, is you mentioned, in your course, the observation of cameras and security, market and advertising, presentation of Disney's self, meaning clothing and accessories, and the sounds and smells of Disneyland. That clothing and accessories thing, the whole Disney bounding, coming in costume when it's allowed, that is something that I feel like has changed a ton. And I must imagine you've observed that change.
Yeah. And it is, the Dapper Days and all of the ways in which people are, really participating in Disney culture. It used to just be like people would show up like in matching t-shirts and it would be their family reunion on there. But there is like much more engagement. And I wonder if like a lot of that is also related to, the whole sort of emergence of cosplay culture as well, that is, tied to other aspects. But, I think a lot of it really is people using Disneyland as a place to create community, right? We don't seem to have the same kinds of communities that we do. And a lot of this is virtual. A lot of basic human behavior, like this is me from the cultural anthropological level, has noticed that like even my students, especially post-pandemic, are not as good with creating community and not as good as talking to people face to face. And a lot of this is a mediated interaction that takes place over social media. So I think it's not surprising that people are using Disneyland as a place to communicate through social media to create a sense of community, because people do feel alienated. They do feel isolated. We don't have the same kinds of social in-person clubs that we used to have, which is weird. I don't know what those things look like. And I'm from, the sociological perspective, like, there was a book called Bowling Alone that, that's like 40 years old, that talked about how there was a breakdown in, sort of American social culture that created community, and where those things come from, and whether that is from like people moving out from the center of the cities into the suburbs, or different ways in which our own space and place operated. Like somebody pointed out that back when people were hunter gatherers, when they created nomadic communities, they would like build all their huts in a circle that faced each other, but like the way that American houses are, they like face away from each other. And so, is it that the space and place by design has compelled people to be more separate, where like, it used to be, neighborhoods where people talk to their neighbors, but now people find their neighbors to be like the irritating person on the other side of the fence who doesn't move their trash cans in on the right time. So like there has been all of these changes in society that have forced people away from natural communities, and maybe the online communities, or the communities around particular kinds of cultural objects, where a lot of people say like they found their community through anime, or through K-pop, or through Disney, right? Like they're building these imagined communities that are mediated through objects or places or other things, as opposed to like the need that people used to have with, different kinds of social clubs that I think tend to have gone away, maybe because people feel like they have less time, or because, everyone is now working in multiple jobs, but something has fundamentally changed on the fabric of what made sort of American communities and cultures. And now they're bonding together through Instagram and through, joining particular kinds of social media groups.
That's fascinating, because the area I work in live events and live event production and conventions and such. And that world, that business has been doing very well for like a decade now. And the theory behind that is exactly what you said. Like people are kind of tired of just having online existence and searching for in-person community. And that's what conventions allow for these fandoms to come together. So that's really interesting. So you mentioned that first lesson, which was kind of a trick lesson of 1 hour, sit alone, observe. You have your students do this again at night, correct? Where they have to observe, how things are happening during fireworks or a nighttime spectacular or whatever. What are some of the things that are different versus that first time they do that?
Well, the reason I have them do an event is because I want them to figure out, like, where are people going, right? Like, there's always this discussion, like, when you're getting on a ride and there's two lines, do you go to the right or the left? And, the argument is that, like, people tend to go to the right, so everyone should go to the left. But, those things have actually been built into the design so that they end up being the same. But like, how is it that people, I think what I'm trying to get them to see in that case is like, that there is like this herd mentality, and people always tend to go where they see more people, which is weird. Like, especially when you would think people would try to go against that. So, part of that is really just to get them to understand what it is that people are doing, why they think that, also for them to then figure out what is the best way to create an alternative path through Disneyland that avoids all of the crowds, or like, makes more sense. So I'm trying to get them to think about like, how do you work against the herd mentality? So that's really that's the only sort of thing, they're simple lessons that I'm trying to get them to. And they're things that I could tell them, but when they experience them, it is much more impactful. So that's just why I traumatize them this way. I send them to Disneyland and I don't let them have any fun, but that allows them to really sort of hone in on the lessons of, what human behavior is actually like.
Did you ever, witness something yourself or through a student that perhaps was an area where Disney could make an improvement, and you've actually seen that improvement made through the years? Like Disneyland has actually changed something that corrects or fixes a problem you might have observed?
I don't know. I mean, there was once, like the Golden Nugget had a show, for decades, and then they changed it to a new show. And in the new show, it was like a beauty contest, but like one of the characters was supposed to be like the ugliest woman ever, and it was a man in drag. And we had some trans students who said, this is actually really offensive and problematic. And so the class wrote letters to Disneyland, and that show actually disappeared. I don't necessarily know this. I'm not saying that it was the class, but it was a moment that a lot of people recognize that this is a problematic representation. And so, Disney keeps their shows forever. And the fact that this show disappeared really quickly, was the only time that I think maybe some of the students and the class had some impact on that, because they wrote letters to Disneyland and said, we find the show offensive and problematic for these reasons. I was surprised because I was like, the last show was here for 20 years, and that show was gone by summer, and it was new.
In your syllabus, there is a requirement for students to post stuff on Facebook. And I was just kind of curious where this came from. Why is this sort of interaction between students encouraged?
Well, it's a closed Facebook group, so they're the only ones who see it. But it's basically to keep them thinking about the class constantly. So even though we're not in class, because they're posting, and because at the time, the students now have to actually have Facebook accounts, like they have to open them up because they don't have them. But when we did it, it was a natural part of the way that students behave because it's 20 years old. And so the students, I would see like on a Saturday night at 2 a.m., like 3 students arguing about a particular, article and how it applies to what's happening at Disneyland. So that was just a way to keep the class going outside of the classroom, because we realized if they're thinking about it all the time. The first time we did it, we used this thing called PB Wiki, which was like this, Wikipedia thing that existed 20 years ago that was like a private class wiki, and everybody could upload their pictures. But it's also so that people can upload their observations and their photos, and other students can comment on what it is that they think is happening. And the students can say, this is what I think is happening. Does anyone have any other thoughts? And then they can have these ongoing conversations outside of class. So, the class is really basically occurring every single day. Every day they're thinking about the class. And so, I wanted a place where, if something came up, they could, and it's funny because like the Facebook things are all still there, and periodically, like I'll get a notification like, Anthropology of Space and Place 2014, somebody posted this thing. And so, they're still using it to like communicate about Disney specific things or Space and Place specific things.
That's funny.
Why. Yeah.
Of course, there are a bunch of course readings to go along with this class, and I'm curious, a lot of these books, some of these books are not specifically about Disneyland, but a lot of them are about Disney and Disneyland. When you started building this itinerary for the course, were you surprised at how many books there were about Disneyland, about this specific subject matter? Yes.
I had known like a couple, like an anthropologist at Disneyland and the Smile Factory. Like those are the 2 classics from like maybe the 60s or 70s. Got Diners, Disneyland to Utopia. Like they're like a couple that were early. They were all by sociologists. But, later there was a lot more sort of critique about, the representation. Giraud has a book called The End of Innocence, I think, that talks about like a lot of criticisms about Disney animation representation. Then there's French theorist Jean Baudrillard, who talks about this idea of the simulacra and how Disneyland has created this sort of perfectly simulated environment of real life. There's a lot of ways that you can apply Disneyland to social theories. So like, the Michel Foucault looking at ideas of like governmentality and the panopticon, or Pierre Bourdieu's idea of distinction in social class and taste, right? Like Disneyland encourages a particular form of taste. And I think taste is a really interesting way to think about like social stratification. Like why do people acquire certain kinds of tastes, and what is the taste for Disneyland? I mean, honestly, when people used to say it's an acquired taste, I used to think, why would you learn to like something that you don't like? Because it's a social signifier, right? It's a status signifier. And in a lot of ways, how does Disneyland motivate that particular kind of belief in order to make you buy into Disneyland? So, we come at it from a whole bunch of different ways. Like, what is it that makes Disneyland unique? How is it part of an active process of cultural production that the Disney company or Imagineers are putting forth, but also like a social aspect that as audiences, we're sort of mediating and consuming in our own way, or in the case of something like Disney bounding, reinventing in a way that is, allowing us to play in particular ways. So it's interesting to see, like, how humans are creative in their responses to objects, whether it's the creators or the Imagineers making a space or the audiences responding to the space.
Do you think that in most cases, Disneyland's creating something to encourage us to react a specific way? Or do you think Disney is reacting to what the audience is telling them they want?
I think that now, but I think before they were trying to create something. I mean, Walt was trying to create something that people could respond to in a particular way. And I think Epcot, if you look at it, if that is sort of his, he really wanted to create an actual thing like Celebration, right? He wanted to create a prototype community that people could live in. And I feel like he had ideas that he wanted to create spaces that people would behave in particular ways. If he created this ideal, utopic, planned community, then people would, behave in different ways. And I feel like that's what his idea was for Disneyland. And I feel like people did try to incorporate that early on into the park over different years. I remember, like, I was reading Jack Lindquist's book, In Service to the Mouse, when he talks about when he was, in charge, he wanted to change Main Street every 10 years, right? He wanted Main Street to be the memory of the current generation. So, like, every 10 years, they would update Main Street 10 more years. And eventually, like, Main Street would look like it did in the 1970s. People were like, absolutely not. But, these ideas that people had, it's not, there's a lot of thought that has gone into every single environment in Disneyland, and people are debating that all the time. So I think they think they're doing something that will have a particular effect. I think before the effect was, to try to make people feel safe and happy. And now it is to be, popular, or to, encourage a different demographic of people. Like, honestly, like, Galaxy's Edge is a totally different demographic. Marvel Campus is a different demographic of what we had thought of was the basic sort of Disney family unit.
I wish your course were an entire semester instead of 1 month, because I really wish that, like, one of the weeks you went to Universal Studios Hollywood or Knott's Berry Farm and had the students observe there and kind of see the differences. Because I do think, rightfully or wrong, perhaps, but, Disney is considered to be, quote unquote, the best at this.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious, just from your student's point of view or from just an actual study, whether or not that's true. I have my theories, but I don't know. I'm just, a bit biased, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I know. I feel like they're very different. Disney really is in a class of its own. So, I need to figure out how that works. Last year in June, I took a class to Tokyo Disneyland. It was just a class on Japan, but we ended up at Tokyo Disneyland. And Tokyo Disneyland's like a whole other thing. Like, it's completely different and magical in its own way. But it is interesting to, like, do that comparison of, like, different kinds of parks, even Disney parks. But yeah, you can't compare any other theme park in the United States to a Disney park.
You mentioned that most of your students are diehard Disney fans. I am curious, do you find that most of these students leave the course with a deeper appreciation for Disneyland, or is sometimes it too much pulling back the curtain and really, oh gosh, I can't go enjoy this place anymore because my brain's thinking about X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, they tell me during the course that I'm ruining Disneyland for them, but, they all go back. It's fine. But, like, at the time, yes, they definitely are like, you're ruining Disneyland for us. You're ruining this. You're ruining that. That's what Anthropology does. It ruins things. And I'm like, it's just making you think about them critically. That's all. And, then you can enjoy it differently. So.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I love this course concept is great. I've loved this conversation. I just want to end with kind of, we're talking about one very specific course that you teach, but Disney learning at universities has become a thing. And I think it's way more common than people realize. I don't know how long ago this started. Perhaps you have more info on that. But I'd just love to kind of wrap things up with what are your thoughts on that? And and we've kind of touched on why this works and why people are interested, but just it seems to have been accepted, I guess, is my point. My guess is if you were to pitch this today versus you pitching it 20 years ago, it's probably a lot easier to get approved.
Yeah, I think it is a lot easier to get approved. Like, people see this as like a normal thing now. There's Disnet, which is like a Disney academic forum where they like talk about, how do you study Disney or teach with Disney. There's a lot of actual academic books on Disney, Disneyland, and behavior. But, a lot of that, I imagine, came out of just the general studies of fandom. A lot of that, I think, spun out of Comic-Con, which, again, one of those places where people can build community and find their people. Like, I've been going to Comic-Con my whole life. So I stopped actually going because it got really scary in San Diego about 15 years ago. But I mean, I've, I guess I've always been I've always found popular culture more intriguing because, why is it that at this moment people want to do these things? Like, what is it about, whatever they are, K-pop demon hunter things that make people, like, in that moment, rally around a particular concept or idea or thing? What is it in their life that they feel like this is fulfilling in that moment? So, recently I've noticed, like, they're talking about different kinds of classes that are popular culture classes across the United States, right? Like, there was an article last year about this place has a Taylor Swift class. This place has a Beyonce class. Like, this place has a Disney class. But this is what people are interested in. So we really do need to understand what it is that draws people to them. So I feel like it is a good time for Disney and Disneyland. And it also entices students to really be engaged in the coursework because it's something that they're invested in and something that has meaning to them, maybe more so than Shakespeare.
In your studies, have you found that when something becomes huge and very popular and part of pop culture, is it typically an individual's taste? There's a lot of people who have this desire for this thing, or is a great majority of that interest pressure from other people to like something, wanting to fit in? Because, like, I mean, right now, sorry, I have young nieces and nephew. This 6-7 thing is driving me crazy. On Halloween night, I was out watching the kids trick or treat. The 6-7 thing, I'm like, I'm such an old, like, I literally had to remind myself, is like, dude, let these kids have fun. It's Halloween. But it was driving me nuts. So, like, that's something that means nothing, right? Yes. Yet it's become a massive part of pop culture.
Yeah.
So what is it like? Are we all cows following each other, or what?
Well, I think that's a thing that social media created, like, right? And like, this is also how people feel like they're connected to something. And I feel like people are feeling lonely and disenfranchised, and that's how they feel connected, by glomming onto a thing. I mean, in the cycle of fashion, like in anthropology, there was an anthropologist studied the cycles of fashion, and then they become faster and faster. But like, they're just like, in a moment, right? Like, these things are happening so quickly because people just move on to the next thing. And there's always this sort of rush, right? Like that idea of like Gladwell's tipping point, that like people want to be like, at the moment where things become popular, but they don't then want to be like the ones who are like behind, right? So like there's this constant rush to like be at the next thing, and like everybody is sort of doing that, and it's a very sort of culture industry kind of behavior that allows people to be distracted by stuff rather than actually thinking about the economic, political, cultural situation they're actually in the world. That's always been the argument. And so, FOMO culture has developed to like allow them to continue to be distracted by media, which makes us maybe easier to be led along like cows or lemmings, whatever the case may be.
Stephanie, this has been an awesome conversation. I've truly, truly enjoyed it. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. This was super fun.
And now it's time to bring in Meredith from Mini Memories Travel for another Disney vacation tip. But before we get to that tip, let's talk a bit about some news. How you doing, Meredith?
I'm wonderful, Jeff. How are you?
I'm doing well. You're in New York. It must be getting nice and chilly and appropriately cold for the season.
Yeah, yesterday we had fire. Our firewood was delivered, and it feels cozy and wonderful. So, yeah.
Nice. Excellent. So let's talk about some Disney news because recently there was some drone testing happening at Disney's Golden Oak Ranch facility in Santa Clarita, California. Before I jump into the drone stuff, I'm just curious, are you familiar with Golden Oak Ranch?
I am. I am. I think it's very cool. I've never been, but I think it's amazing.
Yeah, so Walt purchased this facility in 1959. A lot of content was shot there, from The Parent Trap to The Shaggy Dog. More recently, WandaVision, if there were fans of that show on Disney Plus, they used it. One of my personal favorites, not Disney related, but Back to the Future shot there. If you're familiar with that film, the beginning when Marty first goes back to 1955 and crashes into that barn. That barn
so
and
funny.
home. Yeah, so the Twin Pines farm
Yeah,
there
exactly.
is that's the Golden Oak Ranch. And I've never been there either. It's one of those facilities. Yeah, it's one of those facilities that isn't really open to the public. But it's funny because just hearing this news, I'm like, I really just need to make some phone calls and like get there because I want to check out this. There's a great, oh my God, if anybody's ever coming to LA, it's not close to Los Angeles itself, but the Paramount Ranch is really cool. It is not owned by Paramount anymore. I think it's just like a national park, but it's still called the Paramount Ranch. And they shot like Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman there. And so it was an old, Western set. And actually more recently, there was some big, I think, HBO show, maybe Westworld, I think might have used it. Yeah, and there was a fire, I don't know, less than a decade ago that burnt a lot of that down, but they rebuilt it from what I understand. But in any case, go to the Paramount Ranch. I want to say it's like an hour and a half drive from Los Angeles, but it's pretty cool. In any case, I digress. So there was some drone testing happening in this facility. And of course, it being Southern California, the immediate thought is, oh my gosh, is Disney testing drones for Disneyland Resort? And from what I hear, the answer is no. I hear they're being tested for Paris or somewhere else. We've never had a drone show here at Disneyland Resort. Have you ever seen a drone show in a Disney park?
Disney Springs, yeah.
You did? The Christmas one?
Yeah. It's amazing.
How was that? Yeah?
Yeah, I love them. We just actually saw one by accident in Fort Lauderdale. Not really. I got stuck in Fort Lauderdale and there was a drone show in Pompano Beach. And I'm like, well, let's go see it because the one in Disney Springs was so cool. My husband hadn't seen it. So I really like them. I think it's great.
Yeah, I mean, there's that whole conversation of like, are drones replacing fireworks, which I understand why you would want that. Number one, probably cheaper. Number two, better for the environment. But, fireworks are amazing. Drones are amazing. I love them. I've never seen them in a Disney park. I've seen them at Universal Studios Hollywood, which I guess, there's a lot of conversation about, because of the laws in Southern California, it's more difficult to use them here. But I got to say, like San Diego Comic-Con has used them a bunch. As I said, Universal Studios Hollywood, I saw it during one of the Hogwarts projection shows, which was really cool. So not impossible, but maybe because of the way Disneyland is set up, there's just no good options.
Yeah.
I don't know. I hope I'm wrong. It would be lovely if this was a test for Disneyland Resort, but from what I'm hearing, this is most likely for Disneyland Paris. But still kind of cool that they were testing it here in Southern California, and we saw Buzz Lightyear up in the sky with, all the drones, and it was fun.
That is so cool.
Yeah, so keep your eye on that. We'll have to see where the next drone show is going, but testing is happening. And moving on from there, let's talk about a little something that came out. Jennifer Lawrence and Emma Stone are attached to produce a movie starring none other than Miss Piggy. Cola Scola, who just won a Tony Award for Oh Mary, is writing the script. And I mean, a Miss Piggy-centered movie, I think it's been, since I think the last big screen Muppet movie was Muppets Most Wanted, right? And that was 2014. So over a decade ago. So I'm all for big screen Muppets, although who knows, maybe this would go to Disney Plus. But with these people attached, I feel like it sounds like a big screen movie. But who knows? The industry is weird right now. But yeah, Miss Piggy getting her own movie. And I think this would be the first time she gets her own movie.
I think so too. And I love her so much. She's the biggest diva ever. She's so iconic. My sister loved her so much that we swear she got her hair cut like her.
That's great. Now, of course, we're heading into the holiday season. I am a huge fan of Muppet holiday projects. Are you familiar with Muppet Family Christmas?
I should be. I've watched. I give me a little bit of the plot, and I bet
This is literally like all the Muppets get together at a farmhouse, and it's like
Yes,
the
yes,
Muppets
yes.
and the Fraggles and Sesame Street.
yes, and because it had Fraggles, it totally. I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, 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 yes. Like Grandma goes on vacation and they go there. Yes, I love it.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I think you can find it on YouTube, or at least some. There's so many different cuts of it; it drives me crazy. But it's a special I grew up with, and it's one of my favorites. And the Muppets make the best holiday specials.
I
So
agree.
highly recommend. But yeah, we got a Miss Piggy movie coming. Apparently, it sounds like it's still early in the process. It sounded like this was a bit of a leak, or maybe an intentional leak. Jennifer Lawrence was on a podcast and she kind of was like, I don't know if I can talk about this, but I'm going to, which often means I was given permission and I'm playing this like it's something special. But, it's cool. Miss Piggy and Jennifer Lawrence, Emma Stone, Cola Scola. So that's quite the team. That is happening.
It is.
But speaking of the Muppets, do you happen to remember a story from, I don't know, a month or two ago we talked about with Rob Lake Magic with special guest The Muppets hitting Broadway?
So, Jeff, I was supposed to go. I had bought my son tickets for his 28th birthday, which was this past weekend, and we were going, but now we were stuck in Fort Lauderdale and couldn't go, and now it's closed.
Yeah, so this show is closing much, much, much earlier than it was supposed to. I was supposed to go the day before Thanksgiving. I was all set to go. And then we got the news after 4, real performances. They had some preview performances, but since opening night, there were 4 performances. And the show closed. And this was a limited run to begin with. It was only supposed to go into January. It's very normal for a magic show of some sort to come to Broadway for the holiday season. It's something the whole family can enjoy together. Apparently, this was not going well. And to be completely honest, I was not looking forward to the show in the sense that, I think this is going to be great. I just wanted to witness the history of the Muppets being on Broadway for the first time. That's what was exciting to me. I'd never heard of this magician. I'm sure he's fine. But my big thing was, is it going to be like the Muppeteers doing this? Because it's a limited run, so that's possible. But from what I'm hearing, it was treated more like a theme park show, voices pre-recorded, different puppeteers. So all of that made it less interesting to me. And from what I hear, the Muppets were kind of barely in it, like 10 or 15 minutes or something. Yeah. So, I'm not heartbroken that I'm missing the show. I'm heartbroken that I'm missing the history, I guess.
Right. No, I agree. And it just, even the news clips they did on it, I watched him, I don't know if it was Good Morning America, wherever, do a thing where he put it in a box and predicted what they were going to say. And I'm like, that just doesn't, that's not magical to me.
Yeah, it was. Listen, I don't want to crap on this poor guy, Rob Lake, but he must be heartbroken. I mean, to get a Broadway show, to get one with the Muppets, I'm sure it was a dream come true. And honestly, I mean, the thing that really sucks is a lot of these people who thought they had a job into January through the holiday season are now unemployed. So it's never fun to see a show close early on Broadway, no matter how good or bad it is or your feelings toward it. So it sucks. And selfishly, I'm just a little upset because I was going to it, and same with you apparently.
Exactly.
So my God, I mean, that's a short run, 4 performances. It's not the shortest. There have been shows that have closed after after opening night. So it's not the shortest, but the thing that kind of pisses me off is this is going to be the excuse I feel that Disney uses for years as to why we're not seeing the Muppets on Broadway. Because I think the Muppets on Broadway could be successful. I think if and when it happens, Disney Theatrical should do it. This was simply a licensing deal, it sounds like. Not super exciting, but wah, wah. But we got a Miss Piggy movie, so there's that.
Exactly.
At least the start. the start of a Miss Piggy movie. Now let's move on to some Disney experiences we've had recently. Meredith, what have you been up to? Anything?
Not a lot, except that I am going to Disney with my 2 sisters for the first time since we were in 4th grade.
And wow. Really... When you say Disney, which
Walt
do you
Disney
mean
World.
Walt Disney World?
Walt Disney World.
That's something I don't know if people know this who don't live on the East Coast, but having grown up in Massachusetts, I do feel like when people say, when they're going to Walt Disney World and they're from like the East Coast, they say, we're going to Disney. They don't say that.
That's all we say.
Even more than, I mean, listeners of this podcast know about my pet peeve when people say Disney World and not Walt Disney World. But for some reason, like when people say I'm going to Disney, it doesn't drive me as crazy. And I also know I'm like, okay, first of all, you're probably from the East Coast if you say we're going to Disney. And I don't know, it just cracks me up because even here on the West Coast, we don't say, oh, I'm going to Disney this weekend. I'm going to Disneyland this weekend, so that's so funny. But I knew what you meant. I just wanted to confirm.
Absolutely,
cool.
yes.
So you're going with your sisters and you haven't been since you were how old?
I was in fourth grade. And I'm the youngest. So I have actually ran into my sister by accident in Walt Disney World. See, I tried, Jeff. I tried. I was standing in line to get food for Fantasmic, and all of a sudden behind me, I hear, I know that voice. I'm like, I knew you were here, miss. I didn't think we'd see each other, but we got to see her. And then my middle sister, she and I took our kids together regularly when they were little, but this is the first time the three girls are going to be there together, and we're spending Martin Luther King weekend there. And it's been really fun to throw some of my magic in for my sisters, which, things that they've never eaten the castle. So of course we're eating in the castle. And I have a whole bunch of little surprises up my sleeve for them. And it really has ignited the magic back in me of being like, I want them to see what I do and what I am good at, and have a little bit of, sparkle and pixie dust in their lives.
That's awesome. Oh, I love that. And you're certainly the person to have planned the trip for them. So that's really, really cool. That'll be magical. So that's in January?
Yeah.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, I experienced something that we talked about. I think it was in the last episode. I was at Disneyland, and so I checked out. I did it after we were talking about it's an attraction. It's easy to skip for years, but I went on the Storybook Land canal boats. I saw the new Rapunzel Tower. It is beautiful. The attraction is decked out for Christmas, so all the tiny little wreaths are on the little models, and it looks so cute. And the Rapunzel Tower is very nice. I did it after the sun had set, so I got the second song that they play. And it was a bit rainy, I will say. But yeah, I was happy to check that out. It was definitely on the list of, as I was saying last time, I don't do this often enough. And it really is cute. I will say, though, like the older you get, it is tough to get off that boat and just sit in that. I have long legs. And so even on Pirates of the Caribbean, like I have to sit in a position that's fairly uncomfortable. And then I'll get in a position that works. And then when it's time to get up, I'm just like, oh my God, this is not comfortable at all. But whatever, it's fine.
All of my men, all four of them are 6'3". So they all have that trouble. And then I get squished and they're like, well, I would have sit across from mom. I would have sit here because her legs are short.
Yeah. Very, very cool. So yeah, that's what's been going on. And with that, what is this month's Disney travel tip?
Well, it is based on what I'm doing with my sisters. Is we're actually staying off property, which is not something I do on the regular. This was a last minute planned trip. Like literally I came up with it a couple weeks ago, and I'm like, this is what I want to give you ladies for your birthday and Christmas. And so we're staying off. So we each have our own room and all that, stuff you like to do when you're older. I'm planning it. And I realized that offsite is really different to book for Walt Disney World and to plan for Walt Disney World. My tip this month is about how to do that. First, you can't book all your dining at once. So you've got to it's right. I'm in the middle of it right now. I had to book yesterday, and I had to book this morning, and I'll have to book tomorrow, and then in the next 2 days. And it's getting that and knowing.
Explain that for a sec. So if you're going, what is it, a 60-day window or whatever?
It is a 60-day window. And when you book on site, you can book for 10 days. You can book for up to 10 days. So most people aren't going for longer than 10 days. And so it's for your entire trip.
So the 60-day window starts at the first day of your trip. Whereas if you're off property, 60 days is 60 days or whatever it is. Is it even 60 days? How many days is it?
It's exactly the same days, which is lovely. It's 60 days, but you have to do it every morning. So it's an every morning wake up. We're not going at a busy time, so I don't have to be up at 6 a.m. But if it was offsite at a busy time, I would be up every morning at 6 a.m. and I'm not a morning person. But that's what you have to do to get, if we want to eat in Cinderella's castle, and we're eating, again, this is part of my tip, is we're eating before the park opens. for breakfast, because if you're not on site, you don't get the extra 30 minutes. So I wanted to have us done eating, so that we are already at that part of the park when it opens to offsite guests. So these are just little tips that make it, like, put me ahead of the crowd, which is always the goal for me with planning, is I don't like crowds or lines. So, and I like Walt Disney World, so I'm a little bit talking out of both sides because they come hand in hand, but I like to minimize that. And so that's one of my tips, is book the breakfast before the park opens, but make sure you're early enough that you're out of breakfast to hit the back of the park before people get there.
So what I'm hearing is you're not a morning person unless you're on a Disney vacation.
Exactly. And my children are identical. When we go anywhere, I have to beg them to get up unless we have something, planned. But when we are at Walt Disney World, no question, all three boys were ready to go, because they know how we do it. We hit it in the morning, we relax in the afternoon, and then we go in for magic at night. So they're well trained.
So do you typically leave the park at some point in the afternoon, and will that change staying off site?
Jeff, we're going to do it both ways. We're going for 4 days, and it'll be 2 days that we do it and 2 days that we don't, because it is getting in and out of the parks takes a long time when you're staying off site. When you're at Magic Kingdom, you have to get all the way to Transportation Center. Yes, I cheat. I walk over to the Contemporary and get my Uber and go, but that still takes a little more time. And or take the monorail over to the Contemporary and get your Uber. But it factors into when to go. Again, we're going very slow season, so the traffic shouldn't be bad. We should be able to zip in and out. And I love my afternoon breaks. Even if we don't leave the park per se, we're going to go to a resort and relax at the resort.
That's a good idea. That's actually a really good idea. If you're not staying close, you can still leave the park and go chill. There are plenty of resorts, the hotels around Magic Kingdom where you can just kind of go chill for a bit. So that's a good tip. If I were a local, I'm sure I would feel differently. But I got to tell you, going to Walt Disney World on average once a year, I actually really like the boat ride from TTC to Magic Kingdom. I know it's not a popular opinion, but I love it.
And I got to promise you, my sisters and I will be doing that, because one of our pictures from back in 1977 or 8 when we went is my whole family. My mom stood back, and it's my dad and the 4 kids getting on the boat. And I have it framed. It's one of my favorites because it's so, we're all in the little 70s short shorts with our knee socks all the way up to our knees. I mean, my sister has said, we have to recreate that photo. And I'm like, I am not wearing that, but okay.
Not all day. Yeah, that's great. Oh, I love that for you. That's going to be such a fun trip. So very cool. I am curious though, cost aside, is there any benefit to staying off property that you've found, either personally or you've heard from one of your clients? Like, hey, I'd rather do that because...
Some of them think like you get more for your money. The Four Seasons gets a lot of people that book it, and they love the experience. Mostly it's a cost thing, Jeff. The pro that I always get is if I go off cycle, like not during vacations, and it doesn't affect me that much. So I'm saving a lot of money. I have a kitchen. I have, the extra space. Those are the pros. Can you get them on property? Yes, they're going to cost you a lot more.
Let me ask you this. If you had a client who was doing half their trip at Walt Disney World and let's say half their trip at Universal, would you say, hey, go spend half of it at a Disney hotel and the other half at a Universal hotel? Or would you say stay off property, get a car, go between the two? Like, I don't know. This is just a hypothetical.
I book it all the time. And I do always recommend for Universal Studios Orlando that you stay at one of the ones that gives you the express line. It's huge, if you're going, especially during a vacation period, it is such a huge benefit. It is such a time saver. It is. And it also, they throw in, you get express at the restaurants. You don't have to have a reservation, and you walk up at City Walk and you show your key and say, hey, I'm staying at Portofino. And they go, okay, you're at the head of the wait list line. So there are so many benefits at Universal that always, if they can afford it, I do that. Yes, I book it where they stay at one place. They're like, I'm not moving. But it is so easy to, with money not being an object, which is not reality at this point in the world, it is easy. I can do it, and I can plan their transportation between the two. It's part of the package I book when I do Walt Disney World and Universal. I can make it really seamless, but there's nothing more seamless than unpacking once and being in one place, if you don't mind driving. And, you do have to factor it all in. The costs are more than people think, because often you pay for a car at the hotel, pay to park at the hotel. You have to pay to park at the theme parks. People don't always know that you save their receipt when you enter and exit the park, that you don't have to pay twice. I'll have a lot of clients going, well, you told me to leave and I had to pay parking twice. And I'm like, it was in your documents. I told you to save your receipt because you don't have to pay twice. But it is amazing how quickly it adds up if you pay attention.
Yeah. Those are the costs that I hate. Just the stuff you don't think of. It's the worst.
Exactly.
Very cool. Well, folks, you can get Meredith's top 10 tips for visiting Walt Disney World simply by contacting her and asking for the Disney Coast to Coast bonus document with no obligations whatsoever. You can find Meredith's contact info using the Mini Memories travel link in this episode's description. And don't forget, Meredith can help you plan any vacation you'd like at zero cost to you. Excellent, Meredith. I'll talk to you again next month.
Thank you.
Now, folks, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll be back next month with another. Don't forget that Disney Coast to Coast 2026 wall and desk calendars are now for sale using the link in this episode's description. Each month of the calendar features a photo taken by me, and each of the Disney Parks anniversaries is notated in the calendar. Whether getting a calendar for yourself or as a holiday gift, each purchase helps support future seasons of Disney Coast to Coast. Before I go, I want to give a quick shout out to my friends Courtney and Emily at Book of the Mouse Club podcast and congratulate them on the recent retirement of their show. They've produced over 100 episodes discussing Disney books. I've had the privilege of joining them on their show a couple of times, and they've both been heard on past episodes of Disney Coast to Coast. Congrats to you both on a job well done, and thanks for the great content through the years. Whether you're in the car, planning a Disney trip, cooking dinner, or enjoying a shower, Disney Coast to Coast has episodes available for you to enjoy 24/7 in your favorite podcast app. This episode has been executive produced by Jeffrey Riccio. Gain rewards like Jeffrey, including access to never-before-heard episodes and more by becoming a Patreon member yourself. Until next time, anything you need can be found in this episode's description. From the DCTC hotline, where you can leave a voicemail and be heard on a future episode, contact info to reach me, some free gifts from me to you, and so much more. So be sure to check out this episode's description. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye!